The hospital called at 2:13 in the morning. I know the exact time because I have a habit, when my phone wakes me in the night, of looking at the clock before I look at the screen. Some part of me learned, years ago, to document these moments. To note the hour, as if the precise time of an emergency might someday be useful evidence of something. The number was from a hospital, 40 minutes away. I answered before the second ring. A nurse, calm, professional, the voice of someone who makes calls like this routinely, told me that my brother Ryan had been brought in following a vehicle accident, that he was stable, that there had been a police response at the scene, that I was listed as his emergency contact. "Is there anyone else we should notify?" she asked. I sat up in bed in the dark. My husband Marcus stirred beside me, reached out, found my arm. "No," I said, "I'll come." I was dressed and in the car in 11 minutes. I know this because I looked at the clock again when I started the engine. 2:24 a.m. The roads were empty in the way that roads are empty at that hour. Not peaceful, exactly, but stripped down, honest. The city without its daytime performance. I drove 40 minutes to a hospital I had been to before, for other reasons, on other nights. Ryan was in a curtained bay in the emergency department, his left arm bandaged, a cut above his eyebrow held together with steri strips, smelling of alcohol in the particular way that makes a room smaller. He looked up when I came in, and his face did the thing it always did when I arrived at an emergency, a slight loosening, relief, the expression of someone who has been waiting for the person who fixes things. He said. "I'm here," I said. I spoke to the doctor. I spoke to the police officer waiting in the corridor, a young man who explained the situation with the careful neutrality of someone delivering information they are not permitted to editorialize. I made notes on my phone. I called the attorney whose number I had saved, not the first time, and left a message with his answering service. I sat with Ryan until 4 in the morning, when he fell asleep. I drove home in the early gray light. Marcus was awake when I got back, sitting in the kitchen with coffee, and he looked at me with the expression he had developed over years of mornings like this one. Not impatience, not resentment, but a particular quiet sadness that I had learned to recognize and had never quite found the right response to. "How bad?" he said. "Manageable," I said, "this time." He nodded. I sat down across from him and held the coffee he'd poured for me and looked at the kitchen table, which was ordinary and familiar in hours, and I thought about the drive home, the empty roads, the specific quality of 4 a.m. light, which shows you things without any softening. 3 days later, my brother got married. I wasn't invited. I found out from his wife's Instagram account, which I followed because we had met twice, and she had seemed friendly, and I had thought, the way I always thought, the way I had been thinking for 39 years, that maybe this time things would be different. The photos were beautiful. Ryan looked happy. My parents were in every one. I was not in any of them. I sat with my phone in my hand for a long time, looking at the photographs, and I thought about 2:13 in the morning and the empty roads and the attorney's answering service and 20 years of being the person everyone called. And I thought about how not one of those calls had ever begun with, "We just wanted to hear your voice." But to explain how I got there, I have to go back, all the way back to the first time. I was 19 years old. It was a Tuesday in October, which I remember because I had a midterm on Wednesday that I had been preparing for with the focused anxiety of a first-generation college student who understood, concretely, that her grades were the only scaffolding holding up her future. My phone rang at noon. My mother, her voice at a pitch I hadn't heard before, not quite panic, something adjacent to it, the sound of someone who has been holding themselves together through sheer will and has just reached the limit of that will. My father had been taken to the hospital, chest pains. They were running tests. She didn't know anyone in the city well enough to call. She needed someone to come. I closed my textbook. I took the bus. I didn't have a car yet. Across town to a hospital I'd never been to, and I found my mother in a waiting room, and I sat with her for 4 hours while they ran tests and determined that my father had experienced a cardiac event that was serious but not catastrophic, that he would need monitoring and medication and significant lifestyle changes, and that he could go home in 2 days. I handled the discharge paperwork. I arranged the follow-up appointments. I made a list of the medications and their schedules and taped it to the refrigerator in their kitchen. When I left, my mother hugged me and said, "I don't know what we would do without you." I took the bus back to my apartment. I studied until 2 in the morning. I passed the midterm. Nobody asked how the midterm went. I don't think they remembered it was happening. The praise, in the beginning, felt like something. That's the honest part, the part that's difficult to say but that I think matters. Being needed felt, for a long time, like being loved. The two things occupied the same emotional space, and I had not yet developed the ability to distinguish between them. When my mother said she didn't know what they would do without me, I felt it as warmth, as belonging, as proof that I had value in my family's world. It took me years to understand that the sentence was not about me. It was about them. What they would do without me was the subject. I was just the object, the tool whose removal created the problem. But at 19, I didn't hear it that way. At 19, I went home and studied and passed my midterm and felt, underneath the exhaustion, something that I mistook for love. The pattern established itself with the quiet efficiency of something that has never been questioned. Over the years that followed, through my 20s, into my 30s, the calls came with a regularity that I had stopped noticing. The way you stop noticing the sound of traffic when you've lived near a highway long enough. Ryan's car accident at 22. A fender bender that became complicated by the fact that his license had lapsed and the other driver was threatening legal action. I spent a Saturday on the phone with insurance companies and a Monday afternoon in a courthouse waiting room. My mother's dispute with a contractor who had taken a deposit and disappeared. I researched small claims procedures. I filed the paperwork. I attended the hearing. We won, technically, though collecting the judgment was another matter that consumed several more weeks. My father's second cardiac event, which was more serious than the first. A week of hospital visits, another round of discharge planning, a difficult conversation with his cardiologist about what the next year needed to look like. I took notes. I made spreadsheets. I followed up. Ryan's job loss at 26, which was followed by a period of financial instability that became my family's financial instability, in the way that Ryan's problems had always had a tendency to distribute themselves outward. I covered 2 months of his rent, which he did not pay back, which I had known before I wrote the check. Each of these things was, individually, manageable. Each of them was also, individually, someone else's emergency that I had absorbed into my own life with the reflexive willingness of someone who had decided, early and without fully examining the decision, that this was her role. What I noticed, slowly, the way you notice something that has always been present but that you've been looking past, was what the calls did not contain. They did not contain, "How are you doing, Emily? How's the job going? Did you ever take that trip you were talking about? Are you happy?" The calls contained problems. The calls contained needs. The calls contain the specific urgency of people who have a situation and require a solution and have learned, through long practice, where the solution comes from. I was the solution. I was rarely, if ever, the subject. Ryan's engagement was announced on Facebook. I want to say that precisely because the precision matters. Not over dinner, not in a phone call, not in any communication that required someone to think of me specifically and deliberately and decide to include me. A Facebook post tagged photographs of Ryan and a woman named Sophia, who I had met once at a family gathering 2 years earlier and who had seemed pleasant and somewhat overwhelmed by the experience, which was understandable. Ryan's arm around her shoulders. A ring. My parents in the background. My mother's hand over her mouth in the universal gesture of delighted surprise. I saw it at 7 in the morning, scrolling through my phone before I got out of bed. I put the phone down. I lay there for a moment, looking at the ceiling. Then I got up and made coffee and went to work, because I had a presentation at 9 that I had been preparing for 3 weeks, and which was going to happen regardless of what I felt about a Facebook post. The presentation went well. My manager said so. Nobody from my family called to ask about it. 3 weeks after the engagement announcement, Ryan called me, not to tell me about Sophia, or the engagement, or any of the plans they were making. He called because he had received a letter from a collection agency about a debt that had apparently been accumulating since his mid-20s and had finally found him. And he needed someone to help him understand what it meant and what to do about it. I spent 90 minutes on the phone with him that evening. I researched debt validation letters. I explained the process. I did not say, "I found out about your engagement on Facebook." I did not say, "You didn't call me." I helped him because I always helped him, because not helping had not yet become something I knew I was allowed to do. My mother's diagnosis arrived on a Thursday afternoon in September. Not cancer. I want to be clear about that, because the word diagnosis tends to carry a particular weight. It was a cardiac arrhythmia, identified during a routine checkup, requiring medication management and regular monitoring and some significant adjustments to how she was living. Serious, manageable with proper care. She called me first. This I have thought about many times. She called me before she called Ryan, before she called her sister. She called me at 3:47 in the afternoon on a Thursday because I was the person she called when there was a problem, and a diagnosis was a problem. I left work early. I drove to their house. I sat with her and my father and made notes and asked the doctor questions over a speakerphone, and then, over the following weeks, did the things that needed doing. Researched cardiologists, arranged the specialist appointment, helped reorganize the kitchen to support the dietary changes, drove to the pharmacy, set up the medication management system. I delayed a promotion conversation I had been planning to have with my manager because the timing was wrong and I was too exhausted to advocate for myself effectively. I postponed a trip, Marcus, and I had been planning for 2 years. A week in Portugal. Nothing elaborate. Something we had saved for and arranged and quietly looked forward to in the way that you look forward to something that belongs entirely to you. We rescheduled, and then we rescheduled again. My mother recovered well under the new medication regimen. By spring, she was stable. Her color was better. She was gardening again, which was the clearest indicator I had of her actual well-being. When she was gardening, things were all right. She called me when the specialist gave her a good report. "Everything looks good," she said. "The doctor is very pleased." "I'm so glad," I said. "You're such a good daughter," she said. "I don't know what I would do without you." There it was again. That sentence. I had heard it so many times that I had stopped feeling it. It had become texture rather than meaning, wallpaper rather than message. After we hung up, I sat for a moment in the quiet of my office and noticed, for the first time with any real clarity, that I had heard that sentence hundreds of times over 20 years, in dozens of variations, and that it had never once been followed by. "And I want to make sure you know how much you matter to us, not just when we need you, but always. Just because you exist, just because you're ours." It had always stopped at the need. The love, if it was there, apparently required an emergency to surface. The family gathering was in July, a birthday party for my father's 60th. My cousin had organized it. She was good at organizing things, which was why she'd been asked, though the asking had come with an implicit understanding that certain logistical problems would root themselves to me regardless. And they did. A vendor issue with the catering, a miscommunication about the venue timing, my father's medication schedule that nobody else knew well enough to manage around the party's food. I handled these things by phone and email in the week leading up to the party. On the day itself, Ryan called me at noon. He was having car trouble. His vehicle had something wrong with it. He described the symptoms in the vague way of someone who has never learned to pay attention to mechanical things, because someone has always handled those things for him, and he couldn't get to the party. I called a mechanic I knew. I arranged for someone to look at the car that afternoon. I called the party venue and explained Ryan would be late. By the time I had resolved all of this, the party had started. By the time I had driven across the city to deal with one final vendor confusion that my cousin couldn't navigate, the party was 2 hours in. I pulled into the parking lot of the venue and looked at the building, lit warmly from inside, and I could see through the window my family. My parents at the center of a table, my father laughing at something, my mother's hand on his arm. Ryan, who had arrived by then, talking to someone with the easy charm he'd always had in rooms full of people who didn't know him well yet. My cousin had taken photographs. She sent them to the family group chat the next morning. Every photograph had my parents in it. Ryan was in most of them. I was in none. I had been at that party. I had spent the previous week making it possible. I had driven across the city and solved the final problem and walked through the door and stood at the edge of the room and said happy birthday to my father and eaten a plate of food and driven home. But I had been the one solving problems, which meant I had never quite been present. And because I had never quite been present, the camera had looked elsewhere. And because the camera had looked elsewhere, there was no evidence, in 23 photographs of my father's 60th birthday party, that I had been there at all. I looked at the photographs for a long time. Then I put my phone face down on the kitchen table. Marcus came and sat beside me without being asked. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then, "You okay?" I thought about the honest answer. "I've been doing this for 20 years, I said. "I know," he said. "I don't think they know I do it." He was quiet. "I think they know," he said, carefully. "I think they've just never had to think about what happens if you stop." I looked at the phone, face down on the table. Somewhere inside it, the photographs continued to exist. 23 of them. A complete visual record of a birthday party that I had made possible and had not, technically, been part of. My phone lit up. The hospital number appeared on the screen. 2:13 a.m. I looked at it, and I answered, because I always answered. But something, in the answering, had shifted. Something had moved in me, small, quiet, below the threshold of any outward change. The kind of shift that doesn't announce itself, the kind that simply begins. I knew, driving to the hospital at 2:24 in the morning, that something had changed. Not in Ryan, not in my family, in me. It was nothing I could have named precisely in that moment. It was more like a change in air pressure, the particular atmospheric shift that comes before weather, when the sky looks the same as it always does, but something underneath it has reorganized itself. I drove the same roads I had driven before. I parked in the same structure. I walked through the same emergency department doors, which opened with the same pneumatic exhale. Ryan was in the curtained bay. He looked up when I came in. The loosening, the relief. I'm here. I spoke to the doctor. I spoke to the officer in the corridor, a different one this time, older, who gave me the same carefully neutral account of events. I called the attorney's answering service. I sat with Ryan until 4 in the morning. All of it was the same, except that somewhere behind my sternum, in a place that had been quiet for a very long time, something was keeping count. I drove home in the gray light. Marcus was in the kitchen. I sat down across from him. I held the coffee. I looked at the table, and I thought, I am 39 years old, and I have been doing this for 20 years, and my brother does not know the name of my doctor, and my parents do not know what I do for work beyond the general category of it, and nobody in my family has ever once called at 2:13 in the morning just to say that they were thinking of me. I did not say any of this to Marcus. I drank the coffee. I went to work. 3 days later, I was eating lunch at my desk when my phone buzzed with a notification. Sophia Turner, Ryan's girlfriend, whose last name I had recently learned from her Facebook profile, had tagged a location. A vineyard 40 minutes outside the city. The kind of place that does weekend weddings for couples who want something intimate and picturesque and slightly rustic, with Edison bulbs strung between wooden beams and wildflowers in mason jars. I clicked on the post. The first photograph was Ryan and Sophia at an altar that was exactly the kind of altar that a place like that would have. Wooden arch. Greenery. Afternoon light doing the thing afternoon light does at outdoor weddings. My parents were in the second photograph. My mother in a dress I had never seen before, pale blue, her hair done in a way that meant she had planned this for some time. My father in a suit he had worn to my cousin's wedding 6 years ago, which I recognized because I had been at that wedding, which was a wedding I had been invited to. Ryan was smiling in every photograph. Sophia was radiant in the way that brides are radiant, the particular glow of someone at the center of a day that has been organized entirely around them. There were 14 photographs. I was not in any of them. I was not in any of them because I had not been there. I had not been there because no one had told me it was happening. I had not been told it was happening because it had not occurred to anyone that I should be there. Not after the engagement announcement on Facebook. Not after the months between the announcement and the wedding. Not after the Tuesday 3 days before, when I had driven 40 minutes in the middle of the night and sat in a hospital emergency department and spoken to a police officer and called an attorney and stayed until 4 in the morning. Not after any of it. I set my phone face down on the desk. I looked at my lunch, which I had been halfway through. I was not hungry anymore. I sat very still for approximately 2 minutes, which is how long it took me to understand, not emotionally, but with a specific, clarifying logic, the way you understand a math problem when the numbers finally resolve into their answer. What the last 20 years had actually been. I had been useful. I had been essential, in the way that infrastructure is essential. Roads, plumbing, electrical systems. Necessary, invisible, unappreciated until absent. I had not been family. Family gets invited to weddings. The infrastructure does not. I did not call Ryan that day. I did not call my parents. I did not send a card, or a message, or a congratulations of any form. This was, for me, an act of such radical departure from my own behavior that it felt physically strange. Like reaching for something with a hand you've just discovered is stronger than you thought. Marcus came home that evening to find me sitting on the back step with a glass of wine, watching the neighbor's dog investigate the fence line with methodical dedication. He sat beside me. He did not ask what was wrong, because he had seen the notification too. He followed Sophia's account as well, in the casual social media way of people who are adjacent to someone's life. And he had sent me a text at lunchtime that said only, "I'm sorry." 2 words, more than anyone in my family had managed. We sat on the back step for a while without talking. The dog finished its investigation and trotted back inside. "I've been their emergency contact for 20 years, I said finally. "I know," Marcus said. "I was there 3 days ago. 3 days. I drove 40 minutes at 2 in the morning and I called the attorney and I sat with him until 4. I know. And nobody called me." I paused. Not to invite me, not to tell me it was happening, not afterward. Marcus was quiet. "The thing is," I said, "I'm not even surprised. That's the part I keep coming back to. I'm not surprised. I recognized this. The moment I saw those photographs, I recognized it, like I already knew. Like some part of me had been expecting something like this for years and had just been refusing to look directly at it." I drank the wine. "Being needed is not the same as being loved," I said. I hadn't planned to say it. It arrived fully formed, from wherever things come from when they've been developing below the surface for a long time. Marcus reached over and held my hand. "No," he said, "it's not." The next emergency came 6 weeks later. Ryan, newly married, apparently undeterred by the events of the week of his wedding, had encountered a situation with his landlord. The apartment he and Sophia had moved into had a lease dispute involving a deposit and some damage claims, and a landlord who was being, according to Ryan's account, completely unreasonable. He called me on a Thursday evening. I was cooking dinner. I let it go to voicemail. I had not planned to do this. The decision was not premeditated in any conscious way. My phone rang, Ryan's name appeared, and my hand, which had reached for phones displaying that name for 20 years, simply did not move. The voicemail was 3 minutes long. He explained the situation. He explained what he needed. He did not mention the wedding. He did not mention the 3 days before the wedding. He spoke in the tone he had always used when calling me with problems, the tone of someone who is frustrated and overwhelmed and has called the person who handles things, expecting the things to be handled. I listened to the voicemail. I set the phone on the counter. I finished cooking dinner. I ate dinner with Marcus, and we talked about his work and a film we'd seen the previous weekend and the neighbor's fence that needed replacing. And it was an ordinary evening in a life that was entirely ours, and I was present in it in a way I had not been present in evenings for as long as I could remember. After dinner, I picked up the phone. I called Ryan back. He answered immediately. Thank God. Did you get my message? The situation is." "Ryan," I said. He stopped. Something in my voice, perhaps. Something that was not the voice he was accustomed to receiving from me. "I got your message," I said. "I'm not going to be able to help with this one." A pause. "What?" "The lease dispute. I can't help with it." Another pause, longer. The silence of someone recalibrating. What do you mean you can't help?" You always. I know, I said. I always have. I'm not going to this time. Emily, this is serious. The landlord is threatening to. I understand. You'll need to find another way to handle it. What other way? I don't know how to. Ryan. I kept my voice level. Not cold. Level. There is a difference, and it mattered to me to get it right. There are tenant advocacy organizations in the city. There are online resources. The attorney I've used before handles landlord-tenant cases. His number is in my texts from 2 years ago. You can find it. You have options. I'm just not one of them right now. The silence on his end had changed quality. Are you serious right now? Yes. Why? What did I do? I thought about 14 photographs. I thought about 2:13 a.m. I thought about 20 years of Sunday afternoons and courthouse waiting rooms and medication schedules taped to refrigerators. I'll let you think about that, I said. Good luck with the landlord. I ended the call. I sat for a moment in the quiet kitchen. My hands were steady. My heart was doing something unfamiliar and not unpleasant. The physiological response, I thought, of a body that has just done something it has been building toward for a very long time. Marcus appeared in the doorway, reading my face. You said no, he said. I said no, I said. He crossed the kitchen and put his arms around me, and I let him. And I stood there for a moment in my own kitchen, in my own life, and breathed. The family's response arrived in stages, like weather. First, confusion. My mother called the next day with the particular careful tone she used when she wanted information without appearing to want it. Had I spoken to Ryan? He'd mentioned I seemed upset about something. Was everything all right? I told her I was fine. She waited for elaboration. I didn't provide any. Second, pressure. Ryan called twice more over the following week. I let both calls go to voicemail. The messages were progressively less confused and more aggrieved. The shift from what happened to this is unreasonable that occurs when someone has decided that your behavior is the problem rather than examining whether their behavior might be. Third, the withdrawal of warmth that had never quite been warmth. My mother's calls became shorter. My father didn't call at all, which was not unusual. He rarely did. But which had a different texture now that I was paying attention to textures. The landlord situation resolved itself. I don't know exactly how. Marcus found out through a peripheral channel that Ryan had, in the end, contacted a tenant advocacy organization, which had helped him send the correct letters, which had resulted in a negotiated outcome. He had managed it himself. It had not been easy, apparently. It had also not been impossible. This was the thing nobody had ever allowed Ryan to discover. That difficulty is not the same as impossibility. That the discomfort of navigating a problem yourself is not a sign that you shouldn't have to. My family had been removing that discomfort for so long that Ryan had come to believe he was incapable of tolerating it. He wasn't. He had just never been required to find out. My parents called together on a Sunday evening, which meant it had been planned, which meant something had shifted in them, some threshold crossed. My father was on the line, which was unusual enough that I noted it immediately. We want to understand what's happening, my mother said. Ryan says you've been distant. We've noticed it too. We're worried about you. Worried about me. I held that phrase for a moment, turning it over. I'm not distant, I said. I'm just not available the way I used to be. But why? She said. Did something happen? Did something happen? I looked at the ceiling. Mom, I said, I want to ask you something, and I want you to actually think about the answer before you respond. A pause. Of course. When was the last time you called me when nothing was wrong? Silence. When was the last time you called to ask how I was doing? Not because there was a problem. Not because Ryan needed something. Not because you needed something. Just to talk to me. Because I'm your daughter and you wanted to hear my voice. The silence stretched. I let it. My mother started. Stop. I went to the hospital at 2 in the morning 3 days before Ryan's wedding, I said. I called the attorney. I sat with him until 4 a.m., and nobody called to tell me the wedding was happening. I paused. I found out from Instagram. My father made a sound I couldn't quite categorize. Emily, my mother said. There was so much going on with the planning. It was very fast. They decided quite suddenly to. Mom, she stopped. I've been your emergency contact for 20 years, I said. I have left work early and canceled trips and delayed things that mattered to me and driven across the city in the middle of the night and sat in waiting rooms and courtrooms and on hold with insurance companies. I have done all of this because I love this family, not because anyone asked me to think about whether it was sustainable, not because anyone checked in afterward to make sure I was okay. My voice was steady. I had not planned this conversation. I had not rehearsed it, but it had been living in me for a long time, in a form that was apparently fully prepared to speak whenever the door opened. I am not angry, I said. I want to be clear about that. I am not calling to assign blame or to punish anyone. I am telling you the truth, because I think this family has spent 20 years operating on an assumption that nobody ever examined, and the assumption is this: that I would always be available, that my availability was a given, that what I sacrificed to be available didn't need to be acknowledged because I was strong enough to absorb it. My mother's breathing had changed on the other end of the line. I am strong enough to absorb it, I said. That was never the question. The question is whether I should have had to. And the answer to that question is something I've needed you to ask for a very long time. My father cleared his throat. He said quietly, "We always knew you'd come." The phrase landed with a specificity that surprised me. He meant it as evidence of reliability, of love, even his version of it, the version that expressed itself through certainty rather than tenderness. "We always knew you'd come." "Dad," I said, "that's the problem. Silence. Real silence. The kind that means something has arrived in a room that can't be walked back from." "If you always knew I'd come," I said, "then you never had to think about what it cost me to come. You never had to wonder if I was okay. You never had to call just to check, because the coming was guaranteed." I heard my mother crying quietly on the other end. "I needed to not be guaranteed," I said. "At least occasionally. I needed you to call when there was nothing wrong. I needed to be in the photographs. I needed someone to ask how the midterm went 30 years ago, after I spent a Tuesday in a hospital waiting room and went home and studied until 2 in the morning." I paused. I needed to matter when I wasn't useful. The line was very quiet. I let it be quiet. What changed after that conversation was not immediate or dramatic. My mother started calling on Sunday evenings, just to talk. The calls were halting at first. She had spent so many years calling with problems that calling without one felt unfamiliar, like a language she was relearning. She would ask about my work, and I would answer, and she would ask a follow-up question, which was new. She remembered things I had mentioned the previous week, which was newer. My father remained quieter than my mother, as he had always been, but he started texting occasionally, brief, slightly awkward messages, the texts of a man who is learning to express something he was never taught to name. A photograph of a bird in their garden, a news article he thought I might find interesting. Short, imperfect, genuine. Ryan and I did not repair things immediately. I did not expect to. The repair of something that has been damaged over 20 years is not a conversation or an apology or a single act of accountability. It is time and changed behavior, and the slow, uncertain process of learning to relate to someone whose primary purpose in your life was previously functional. He called me 3 months after the landlord incident. Not with a problem. He called to say that Sophia was pregnant. I could hear, underneath the announcement, the uncertainty. The awareness that this was the kind of news he should tell his sister, and the awareness that the category of his sister had become complicated. "Congratulations," I said, and I meant it. A pause. He said, "I've been thinking about." "Ryan," I said, "we have time, okay? There's no deadline on this, we have time." A longer pause. "Okay," he said. "Call me when the baby comes," I said. "Yeah," he said, "I will." He did. The life I was building, had been building, was continuing to build, looked different from the outside than it had before. The same job, though I had finally had the promotion conversation with my manager, 6 months after I'd first planned to have it, and it had gone better than I'd feared. A small raise, a new title, more responsibility in areas I was genuinely interested in, rather than areas that required the particular skill set of someone who is good at absorbing other people's crises. The Portugal trip, which Marcus and I finally took in April, which was everything we had quietly imagined it would be and several things we hadn't. I have a photograph from a rooftop in Lisbon at sunset, Marcus laughing at something I just said, the city spreading orange and gold behind him, and whenever I look at it I think, this is what I was postponing. This specific thing. This ordinary joy. The friends who called on birthdays. The dinner parties where I was the guest, and not the organizer. The Saturday mornings with no phone alerts. No crises routing themselves to me. No sense that the day was one emergency away from being repurposed. I had not understood, until I stopped carrying everyone else's weight, how much of my own life I had been missing. My father was hospitalized in November. His heart, again, not catastrophic, but significant, requiring a procedure and several days of monitoring, and the particular reorganization that a medical event imposes on a family's logistics and emotional landscape. My mother called. I was in the middle of something when she called, a dinner with friends, the kind of easy Saturday evening that had become a reliable feature of my life, and I stepped outside to take it. She told me what had happened. I listened. "I'm coming," I said, not because she needed me to come. She had people. My aunt was already there, a neighbor who had become a genuine friend over the years, a family structure that had, in my absence, been forced to develop the kind of distributed support that had always existed for every family member except me. I came because I chose to. That distinction between obligation and choice was everything. I arrived at the hospital at 9 in the evening. My mother was in the waiting room, my aunt beside her. They looked up when I came in, and my mother stood, and I held her for a moment in the fluorescent-lit hallway. She was smaller than she used to be, or I was stronger, or both. My father was stable, resting. I sat with my mother for 2 hours. We talked, and sometimes we didn't talk, and the silence between us was different from the silences we'd had in the past, less loaded, less full of things that weren't being said. Before I left, I looked in on my father. He was awake, tired, the particular tiredness of someone who has been frightened and is now on the other side of the fear. He looked at me. "We always knew you'd come," he said. He said it the same way he'd said it on the phone, months earlier. But this time, something was different in his face. He knew what it meant now. "Dad," I said quietly. "I know," he said. "I know, that's the problem." He had heard me. It had taken time, and a hospital room, and the specific clarity that comes when someone is lying in a bed, and the performances that usually structure daily life are unavailable. But he had heard me. I sat on the edge of the chair beside his bed. "I'm here," I said. "Not because I have to be, because I want to be." He looked at me. "Is there a difference?" he said. "Yes," I said. "There's all the difference." He was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded, slowly. The nod of a man who is 71 years old and has just understood something he should have understood decades earlier, and is choosing, in the time that remains, to acknowledge it. I drove home through the November dark. Marcus was asleep when I got in, but he had left a light on in the kitchen, which he always did when I was coming home late. A small thing, consistent and warm and entirely his own. I stood in the kitchen for a moment. I thought about 20 years of phone calls. I thought about midterm exams and courthouse waiting rooms and medication schedules, and canceled trips and 14 wedding photographs. I thought about Lisbon. I thought about Saturday mornings with no alerts. I thought about Sunday evenings, when my mother called just to talk. I picked up my phone. I opened the phone records. Years of them, the accumulated evidence of a particular kind of relationship, thousands of incoming calls, the dates and times of 20 years of emergencies. I scrolled through them for a while. Then I closed the app. I set the phone on the counter. I turned off the kitchen light, and I walked down the hall toward the warm dark of a house that was mine, a life that was mine, a Saturday morning that would belong entirely to me. For 20 years, my family called me whenever they needed help. Every accident, every debt, every medical form and legal letter and logistical crisis that required someone responsible and reliable and willing to absorb the cost without being asked if the cost was acceptable. I came every time. I answered every time. I drove through the dark every time, because that was who I was and who I had agreed, without quite agreeing, to be. It took me almost as long to understand that being called is not the same as being wanted, that being needed is not the same as being loved, that the family who always knew I would come had never once had to sit with the question of what it would mean to lose me, and that the family I had chosen, Marcus, the friends around our dinner table, the people who called on birthdays and on ordinary Tuesdays and at 2 in the morning just because something funny had happened and they wanted to tell me, had never needed to know I would come. They just wanted me there. That's the whole difference. That's the only difference that matters. And it took me 20 years to understand it. But I got there. I got there.